Hi everyone, my name is Jackie with SMNP Reviews, and today we are going to discuss the pathophysiology of the menstrual cycle. And having a solid knowledge base on the menstrual cycle will allow you to understand so many other things about women's health, including pregnancy and fertility, contraception, and menopause. So let's get started. Before we get too far, we have to remember the main components involved. Normal menstrual function, meaning having a regular cycle with normal menstrual bleeding, requires that 4 structural components are in working order: the uterus, ovaries, pituitary gland, and the hypothalamus. Each of those components releases hormones or reacts to them in a cyclical pattern that becomes the basis for female fertility. And it's actually pretty amazing when you think about it. So now let's list the individual hormones that are involved, and we'll go more in depth with each one coming up. First is gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH, and that is released by the hypothalamus. The next ones, luteinizing hormone, LH, and follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, are released by the anterior pituitary. And lastly, the ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone, which are probably hormones that might sound a little bit more familiar to you. So we just briefly mentioned that the hypothalamus produces GnRH. Do you know what gonadotropin releasing hormone does? The main function of GnRH in the menstrual cycle is to stimulate the anterior pituitary to release LH and FSH. Think of the hypothalamus as really the gatekeeper of this entire process. It monitors the need to stimulate or not stimulate the anterior pituitary to release LH and FSH. And so if the hypothalamus is the gatekeeper that stimulates the anterior pituitary, then we can think of the pituitary gland as the master gland. Do you remember what it's responsible for? The pituitary gland has a variety of functions, such as helping control the thyroid, adrenals, ovaries, and testes. In particular to the menstrual cycle, the anterior pituitary will release LH and FSH. So what does FSH do? FSH promotes the growth of ovarian follicles, and those follicles work to produce eggs to be released later within the cycle. It is secreted continuously with a peak just before ovulation. And this hormone also stimulates the ovaries to produce estrogen, which causes the uterine lining to thicken. And why is that important? Well, the whole point of that is if the person were to become pregnant, then the embryo would have a nice, cushy place to implant itself. Now, LH is secreted in relatively low concentrations until it surges mid-cycle, about 1 to 2 days before ovulation. This surge, referred to as the LH surge, is what prompts the ovary to release a mature egg from a follicle, also known as ovulation. And then after ovulation, the area on the ovary from the ruptured follicle begins to luteinize. Do you know what that means? Let's talk about it. Basically, think of that ruptured follicle as being popped open. As a way of healing itself and in preparation for a possible pregnancy, it luteinizes, or there is a change in the cells to now be able to produce progesterone. And that luteinized follicle is known as the corpus luteum. Moving on to the ovaries. Estrogen is one of the most talked about hormones, especially in women's health. In the menstrual cycle, estrogen is the main hormone up until mid-cycle. It is produced by the growing follicle, thanks to FSH, and has a few functions. Do you remember them? Estrogen is the reason for the physical characteristics of a mature female, and in the uterus, it helps prepare the endometrium for pregnancy. Remember, it's making a nice cushy home for a potential embryo to implant. Then we have progesterone, and this hormone takes over after mid-cycle. As we said, progesterone is produced from the corpus luteum from the ruptured follicle. And in the uterus, the progesterone really ramps up the preparation for pregnancy. Estrogen started the process for a nice cushy endometrium, but the progesterone promotes the growth of even more secretory endometrial cells. And why is that so important? Well, in the event of a pregnancy, progesterone is a key hormone to help maintain a healthy placenta and prevent premature labor. Now that we've talked about each structure and their hormones, let's recap. The process we just talked about is known as the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis, abbreviated HPO axis. So starting in the hypothalamus, it releases GnRH. That causes the anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH. And those hormones then work on the ovaries to produce estrogen and progesterone. You got it. Now that we've discussed the main hormones and their functions, let's review some other terms you should be familiar with, the phases of the menstrual cycle. And this should make quite a bit of sense based on what we've already talked about. But first, how long is a typical menstrual cycle? So these are based off of a 28-day cycle, but really any cycle that is regular between 21 to 35 days is considered normal. But often a regular cycle is discussed as 28 days. So the first phase is the menstrual phase. So what does this entail? These are the days with the heaviest menstrual bleeding from the shedding of the uterine lining. This typically lasts about the first 4 to 5 days. Then comes the follicular phase. Remember, as we talked about, this relates to the FSH stimulating the production of ovarian follicles, and this occurs from around cycle days 5 to 12. Mid-cycle is when ovulation occurs, thanks so much to that LH surge. And then the last phase is the luteal phase during cycle days 15 to 28. So what happens here? During this phase, the corpus luteum from the ruptured follicle is producing progesterone. Now, if pregnancy and implantation does not occur, then the corpus luteum starts to disintegrate. And the corpus luteum disintegrates in a very timely manner over about 14 days. So if there is no pregnancy, the corpus luteum gradually disintegrates, leading to a drop in progesterone. And that causes the cycle to start all over again. And this happens about every 28 days. Okay, now one more time. Let's put it all together now. Here is another visual that may help. I think it's super helpful to see a visual representation of how all of these different components work together. So let's take it phase by phase while looking at this picture here. First, during the menstrual phase, this is when the period or cycle begins. And here the uterine lining is shedding and hormones are at relatively low levels. Now during the follicular phase, you can see the ovarian follicles start to develop and continue to grow. And at the same time, estrogen levels start to climb and the uterine lining begins to thicken. And then during ovulation, we have a spike in FSH, but nothing compared to that LH surge. And as you can see in the picture, the LH surge causes the mature follicle to release an egg in the hopes of being fertilized. And during the luteal phase, you can see in the row of follicular development how that ruptured ovarian follicle turns into the corpus luteum. And because of that, we have higher levels of progesterone and even more thickening of the uterine lining. But towards the end of the cycle, if no pregnancy occurs, as the corpus luteum disintegrates and kind of shrivels up, the progesterone levels drop, eventually followed by the estrogen levels. And the drop in those hormones leads to the shedding of the uterine lining, starting the process all over again. So let's see how we can put all of that information together and work through this question. So normal menstrual bleeding results from a decrease in follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, progesterone, or prolactin. And if you said C, progesterone, you would be correct. Remember that during the luteal phase, cycle days 15 to 28, if implantation does not occur, the corpus luteum breaks down, which causes a significant decrease in progesterone, eventually also leading to a drop of estrogen. And the end result of that is menstrual bleeding. So great work. I hope you found this review helpful and feel more confident in understanding the hormones and phases of the menstrual cycle. Make sure you subscribe to our channel to see our latest videos, and we will see you next time. Happy studying!